Welcome to Narcissist Apocalypse, everyone. I am Brandon Chadwick, and today we're going to be doing an educational follow-up to Catherine's survivor story. We do these now after every survivor story that we're putting out, or at least every new survivor story that we put out. We might start doing it after our re-releases as well. And in this follow-up, I'm going to break down the core themes of Catherine's story, the fear, obligation, guilt, and shame that shaped the relationship. And before we get into any of that, if you want to be a guest like Catherine was on her survivor stories, go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com, click on the guest form button at the top of the page, or email me at narcissistapocalypse@pm.me. And we also have a free newsletter each week, which includes 5 insights related to the previous survivor story episode. A reflection worksheet is in it. It's a downloadable resource that you can have, and everything is free. You can sign up at our website at narcissistapocalypse.com, or just click on the link in our show notes today. So for those of you who haven't listened to that episode yet, and maybe you will listen to it, maybe you won't listen to it, you're going to need context for that survivor story. So we're going to give you some context. So this episode right here, this follow-up episode, makes sense, and you can use some of the things that are going to be mentioned in this episode as a tool of validation for yourself in the future and education as well. So for anyone who has not listened, Catherine shared her story, and it began with trust. Things moved quickly through love bombing, engagement. Things escalated into coercive control, physical violence, and then continued for years through post-separation abuse centered around her son at that point. So going all the way back, Catherine grew up in a very chaotic home. It was shaped by emotional detachment, alcoholism, violence, gaslighting, and when the harm happened, it was denied. And when she was hurt, she was told that she was being dramatic. And that kind of upbringing taught her to question herself, but it also made her be very hypervigilant and really adapt to instability rather than expect protection at all and getting her safety needs met. And at a very, very young age, Catherine began to self-medicate. She struggled with addiction, and eventually what happens is Catherine met the person that became her abuser, but it was under specific circumstances through authority abuse. So what made the beginning really dangerous here was that this relationship started because Catherine's fellow colleague, who was older than her and more senior at the addiction facility she was working at, was the mother of the abuser in this story. And this person pushed Catherine into this relationship to date her son. And this immediately gave this relationship really a big false layer of safety, false layer of credibility. And this person was vouched for by a person that she trusted in the recovery community, which is huge. And at first, her abuser mirrored her strength. He praised her sobriety. He admired her resilience. He made her feel beautiful and exceptional and chosen. And this relationship moved very, very, very fast. Within a few months, he had placed a ring on her finger and told her that they were going to spend their lives together. But once that attachment took hold, at that point, she's really bought in here that this is a trusted, safe relationship. And eventually these things really shifted. He withdrew effort. Lies started to happen. There was pressure around sobriety on her part. Then she gets blamed for when she does drink. Things that matter to her get mocked. He isolates her from family and friends. He uses silent treatments, intimidation, shame. There's cheating, physical violence. All of these things are destabilizing her self, her sense of self, an erosion of self, sense of reality. And she's walking on eggshells and in constant hypervigilance at this point. But it's also something that she was used to a long time ago. And then later, they eventually had a child. So the abuse at this point expands. And what began as coercive control inside the marriage eventually evolved into post separation abuse through custody, court intimidation, and really using their child as a weapon of power and control and punishment. And Catherine just wasn't fighting an abusive man who is her ex. She was also navigating a whole network of enablers, family influence, because this person's dad was in the police force, high up in the police force. The mom is at this addiction center. The therapist that they went to was recommended by the mom. And then eventually the ex starts dating someone who is involved in the courts as well as like a public defender. So then there's institutional protection. And the system really failed Catherine in a lot of ways here, with no checks and balances going on. And there's a lot of different layers here of what Catherine was up against. So something I like to do for people who might ask, why did this person stay? And I always like to do something like this. It might become repetitive after a while. You know, people will ask, why did she stay? Why did she marry this person? Why didn't she leave sooner? But Catherine's story shows us that there's a lot of things going on that prevent these things from happening. It's not just one single thing. And there's a layer of traps that are going on. There's childhood conditioning going on. There was love bombing going on. There was addiction shame that was going on. There was physical intimidation. There was isolation. There was the parenthood aspect of things, which was a trap. There was custody, there was institutional ties in this story. And then there were also people around the abuser who's reinforcing that person's version of reality. So when someone says, I would never have made any of these decisions, to me, I say to that person, you're not experienced this. You have no idea what it is like once you're inside abuse, when you're inside a forest. It's very difficult to see outside, especially when the abuser's reality is what is surrounding the forest completely. So key themes in Catherine's story. And the first one is grooming through trusted authority. So one of the most important parts of Catherine's story is that the relationship was introduced through a trusted authority figure in the recovery community. This person's mother was just not his mother. She was Catherine's colleague. It was someone that Catherine looked up to. It was someone that worked in the treatment environment, in the addiction space, and someone who should have understood the need for strong boundaries, but instead, this person facilitated this relationship. And that matters because it changes the meaning of a lot of early red flags. These things could be forgiven because this person has been vouched for by someone who you respect in a big, big way. So when someone is vouched for by someone you trust, your instincts will get overridden, and you just don't evaluate the person that you are with. You evaluate the whole entire setup through the lens of that borrowed trust. So from the very beginning, Catherine was not just meeting a person, she was really stepping into a kind of a pre-triangulated system. And that's very difficult to get out of very early on. Another big key theme here in Catherine's story is the real fast attachment and the creation of emotional dependency. And this relationship moved really quickly. He praised her, idealized her, made her feel exceptional, and really created a strong sense of their future early on. And he really made marriage feel like it wasn't just like a decision to make, that it was part of like this destiny type of future. And the speed here really matters. And this went really, really fast. Like within the first 3 months, this was occurring, that the ring is being put on a finger here. And it's hard to think about what is actually going on when things are moving fast. So when an attachment forms quickly, there isn't enough time to observe what's going on. The survivor gets bonded to the promise of everything before they've seen any sort of patterns. And once someone is attached to that promise, they often spend a long time trying to get that original version of the person back. And the next one on our key themes here is coercive control through erosion of self. And he was eroding what made Catherine feel like herself. He mocked her spirituality. He mocked her singing. He criticized her body. He isolated her from family and her sobriety peers. He made her feel as though anything that gave her identity, connection, or inner stability was either foolish, embarrassing, or even threatening. So once your world becomes a lot smaller here, the larger the abuser can become inside the world. And, it was through this erosion of the sense of self where she started to become smaller. His voice, him, becomes bigger inside this world, and then coercive control can, spread out further and further and further surrounding you. And then there's also systems-enabled abuse, which occurred during this story, during Catherine's story. And it was big. The mom, blurred lines, therapeutic boundaries, complicated things. The family had police connections. The dad was in the police force. Later on, the partner, the abuser, had legal power in the same courthouse where all the family matters were being handled, as this person was dating someone, public defender in this system. And there was therapist conflict as well, as the mother was the one that hired the therapist for Catherine and her son. So there's another systemic conflict right there. So you have 4 different ways that the system here that is supposed to be protecting you, or should be having rules put around them, are heavily involved in this story and can influence things in a negative way. And this is important because a lot of the times the system fails victims, and victims might blame themselves when the system fails, but a system is failing to protect you. And that is the big takeaway here. Here, very infused into the story are 4 different systems that have all failed Catherine. And many of you have experienced your own versions of this as well. And I think it's a big thing to point out, because a lot of people internalize that and blame themselves, when really the blame should be put on the system. And, there not being checks and balances and people getting away with things that they shouldn't get away with. And up next, we have an analogy, and it is called the rigged house. So imagine you're invited into a house that seems safe, not just because the person opening the door is charming, but because someone you trust tells you it's safe to go inside. So you walk in, and at first everything feels warm. You're welcomed in, you're admired, you're told you belong there. And because of how you entered, you don't think of yourself as walking into danger. You think of yourself as finally arriving somewhere safe. But then little things start to happen. A door doesn't open when it should. A window won't unlock. A light flickers every time you say the wrong thing. And maybe the temperature in the room changes depending on someone else's mood. And at first, you think the house just needs work. So you adjust. You try to keep things calm. You learn which floorboards creak. You learn which rooms feel dangerous. You learn how to move through the house without setting anything off. And for a while, that feels like survival. But over time, something becomes clear. This house was not damaged by accident. It was rigged. The doors were built to control movement. The locks were there on purpose. The wiring was meant to keep you off balance. The unpredictability was part of the design. And even when you finally get out, the house doesn't fully let go because now there are wires running out from it into custody, into court, into paperwork, into your child's life, and into your nervous system. So freedom is not just walking out the front door. And in Catherine's story, that is the part of what makes her experience so painful. She was not just trying to leave a person, she was trying to get free from a whole system that kept finding new ways to stay connected to her. So that is our analogy. And now we're going to move into our regular fear, obligation, guilt, and shame as tools of coercive control. So fear, we're going to start with fear. Fear through intimidation, violence, unpredictability, threats. These were all used to train compliance in Catherine. So coercive control often works by teaching the survivor that resistance comes with consequences. And in Catherine's story, fear was created through intimidation, physical violence, emotional unpredictability, threats, and later through the fear her son could be harmed when he was alone with his father. And the purpose of that fear was not just to frighten her in isolated moments, it was to condition her, to make her think ahead constantly, to monitor her tone, to manage his moods, to avoid conflict before conflict even began, and to start organizing her life around what might happen if he was upset, if the abuser was upset. So this is how coercive control works. And the survivor, Catherine here, began adapting in advance. And once that happens, the abuser doesn't need to use force all the time. The fear keeps doing the work for him. So through these fears of escalation, this narrowed Catherine's choices. So when physical violence enters a relationship, especially choking, restraint, or threats tied to this, the survivor learns that the cost of pushing back might be very high. And this changes the question from what do I want to what is safest. So when someone is living inside that type of question long enough, your autonomy really starts to disappear. And it's not because the survivor has no mind of their own. It's because coercive control has made safety the organizing principle here for every decision that is being made. And these fears kept Catherine focused on survival. And when you're just surviving, clarity isn't always there. And that's a big thing that people who have never gone through abuse, who question decisions, really don't understand. And one of the most important things fear does in coercive control is really keep you in immediate response mode. And you are not calmly assessing patterns. You're just surviving the day. You're anticipating the next shift, and you're just trying to prevent the next incident from occurring. And that means fear itself becomes a barrier to clarity. And that is very useful to an abusive person, because the less psychological space the survivor has to reflect on what is going on, the easier they are to control. And then another fear that was going on for Catherine was the fear of abandonment. And Catherine was repeatedly threatened with forms of abandonment and destabilization during the relationship. On her wedding trip, her abuser told her that he could leave her on the side of the road in extreme heat if she did not stop crying. Threats like this do a lot to frighten a person in the moment. And for someone like Catherine, who came from an environment that was very unstable, where she left the home at a very, very, very young age, was homeless for a long time, and then is seen by this person in this big love bombing whirlwind of what's going on, that type of abandonment and attachment is a big, big thing. So the fear of abandonment becomes huge. So you don't want that to happen. So eventually you really start to comply to what's going on because that attachment has been created. And for a survivor who is coming from instability, this instability is scary, and that fear can, really keep someone in a relationship longer. And that's what it did as one of the many things that kept Catherine in this relationship. This was one of them. And then up next, we have obligation. And for Catherine, obligation to keep everything working. It was used to keep Catherine psychologically tied to him. This is just not, one little obligation. It was a care in all different types of form that turned into control. Even when the relationship is over, obligation to her child can also be used as a way to control her. And in Catherine, the obligation kept expanding. She was pulled into trying to keep the peace, trying to make the relationship work, trying to be good enough, trying to hold the family together, trying to protect her son. And it's important because this obligation really creates a trap. And this trap is that she cares. And a lot of you out there, you care. And this type of coercive control is pulling on the fact that she cares about all of these things. So the obligation here is turning care into control. So a healthy relationship allows care to move both ways. In coercive control, this care gets hijacked. The survivor becomes the regulator. The survivor becomes the stabilizer. The survivor becomes the one who absorbs the pressure, the one who adjusts more, the one who works harder. And over time, that obligation is not expected as a choice. It feels like it is a duty, and that is what Catherine was feeling. And motherhood intensified the obligation here and widened this control system, because once that child was born, it's not necessarily that she's obligated to the partner here. She's in a way obligated to the son and the new child, and the abuser knows that. It's this obligation to the family now, and now more power and control can be brought in, especially if the son is used as a weapon. And we're going to cover more of this in guilt, which is what we're going to start now, guilt. And guilt made it harder for Catherine to really act cleanly on what she knew already. And in Catherine's story, guilt doesn't seem to be really the main force that bonded her to him in the beginning. Fear was really the biggest driver in this story, but guilt still mattered. And Catherine says that when she found out she was pregnant, she was scared because she already knew how he was, and that she carried a lot of guilt about that for a long time. And that's important because the guilt here is not really about protecting him. It is about carrying the weight of knowing something was wrong and then realizing a child is now inside of the same system too. And that kind of guilt can keep a survivor stuck in a loop for a while. I saw enough to know something was wrong. I hoped it would get better anyway, and now my child is part of this too. So a guilt becomes a big part of this, that she's brought her child into this as well. And that's how the guilt of bringing her son into this can then feed, as we mentioned before, the obligation to the family as this form of control. And then we have shame. And with shame was used to diminish Catherine's sense of self. So if fear controls behavior, shame is here to control her identity. And when your self-worth has been weakened, coercive control can really take an even stronger hold and keep you in a relationship longer. And in Catherine's story, shame was activated through childhood wounds, her addiction history, criticism of her body, mocking the things that she gave meaning to, and just repeated attacks on her. So what's going on here is it really starts to shrink who Catherine is. It makes her quieter in some cases, more doubtful, more isolated, less likely to seek support. And all of that, it really increases control. A person who feels humiliated, defective, that they're too much, broken, or just fundamentally lesser than, they become easier to control because they are no longer operating from equal ground at all. So what happens is when there's no even ground, Survivors might try to get more respect, try to regain worth, trying to prove that they are not who the abuser says they are. And that's a powerful position to be in, because now control is not only happening through a fear of punishment, it's also happening through the survivor's desire to get their identity back. And that is a big thing. And shame does a masterful job of eroding your identity. So with all of these things together, coercive control really was able to take hold in a myriad of different ways, and to build onto each other and weave through each other as well. And it really became her whole environment. And I'm sure a lot of you out there have felt that as well. So some takeaways from this story, shame is a really strong tool for an abuser. Catherine dealt with it from her abuser. And if someone can make you feel fundamentally less than them, they can keep you working for their approval for a very long time. Coercive control does not always end at separation, specifically for everyone who has children, and that the children can be used as a weapon. And it's something that you have to understand going forward, that they're going to try and keep the tentacles on you through administrative work. And the other one here is that abuse can enter through trusted relationships, and that, being vouched for in this case, and we've heard many stories like it, someone being vouched for can really let abuse take hold, and red flags and patterns that are going on early in the relationship be ignored, because that vouching is a big thing. So you have to remember, the person vouching for the person may or may not know what this person is like. And even if they know what this person is like, always doubt, I guess, is the rule right now with this. So goals we have for Catherine going forward, and for everyone who's dealt with the same things, rebuild. We want you to rebuild your trust in your instincts. We want you to release shame that never belonged to you. We want you to let rest become normal. We want you to rest more, and just rest, and let your nervous system get back to 100% from where it was before. And we want you to build a life where neither you or your child has to organize themselves around danger anymore. Those are the things that we want for Catherine and everyone who's listening going forward. So I guess before we leave today, just to kind of recap, what Catherine's story was really about. Trust became a really big entry point in her story. The fear trained her to be compliant. Obligation kept her really tied to the relationship longer, trying to keep this system going, along with the guilt that was kind of in there. And then the shame erodes the sense of self. So it makes you feel like you're less than, and you're weakened in that way. And it's, you're trying to prove yourself at that point. And at this point, you're really in survival mode. And I know a lot of you out there can resonate with that and what's going on in your relationships. And either you're in it right now or you've left. And I hope that this episode was helpful to point things out to you, so you can maybe gain some more clarity and inertia going forward. And those of you who are out of it and needed validation, hopefully this did it as well. And, that's it pretty much for this episode. The last things here are just kind of the plugs that we usually do. To go to our website if you want to be on our survivor stories. Go to our website at narcissistapocalypse.com. Click on the guest form button at the top of the page. Email us at narcissistapocalypse@pm.me. And if you want to join our newsletter, which has more reflections, 5 things in the newsletter that have to do with this specific episode. We also have a free workbook. Everything's free. Go to narcissistapocalypse.com and join our newsletter. And that is it for this follow-up educational episode. And once again, from myself and Catherine, we hope you have a good night.